Okay, hey guys. So a lot of my clients have been coming to me lately, especially during this lockdown period, and saying to me, "Look, I've got a heap of tracks for you to mix, but I can't afford your usual rates. How can I, set it up so basically it's a bit cheaper for me to mix?" And the number one thing is essentially I usually mix in Pro Tools, and so it's funny that most people are doing Logic sessions at the moment. Maybe because Logic's more accessible, it comes with better sounds, and it's for the Mac platform, it's pretty amazing. So I've said, well, one thing needs to happen. I need to start mixing in Logic more. And two, basically, I've said to these clients, well, what you can do is save me a lot of time by setting up the session the right way, and so I can then literally just come in and do the tweaks that need to happen. And so today I'm just going to take you through how's the best way to set up a session. And this is probably good to do at the very start too, when you start actually writing the song and the like. Because then you've got this like infrastructure set up, and it's basically designed around the way you'd set up a console, like an SSL or something like that. Mainly because most of these DAWs are actually designed to emulate a console. Plus, I generally, when I mix, I use an SSL Sigma, which is a summing box, which basically also emulates a proper console. I mix into a G-Bus compressor and have 32 I/O, which is like 32 channels of a console, and then do the channel strips digitally. But at the same time, the principle's the same. And there's going to be a few tips in this today, especially in setting up things like reverbs and delays, those kind of things, which I notice a lot of clients, if they haven't been properly taught or shown how to set up a session, often I'll get, vocals with, say a reverb as an insert. And basically, you should never, there are very rare cases where you would use a reverb as an insert and a delay more often, but essentially both of those things you should be setting them up as sends essentially. So I'm going to take you through that today, and also just how to set up the session, what's the best way to do it, especially if you're going to send it to a mix engineer or someone like that and you want them to be able to just get in there and actually start mixing, because literally it can take 2 to 3 hours, 1 to 3 hours basically, to set up a session, especially if I'm going to export all the stuff out of a Logic session and take it into Pro Tools. So today we're going to work inside Logic. I do work in Logic, Ableton, Pro Tools, and Reason sometimes. Yes, there are other DAWs as well, like Cubase, which I used to have. But yeah, they're the main ones. But if I'm going to mix, I generally only mix in Pro Tools, mainly because it works well with the console. But I'm going to have to, obviously, especially during this COVID thing and people have got less money and also are trying to do more songs, adapt to Logic. So I'm going to show you basically how to set up the session, and this works for both Pro Tools and Logic. In fact, it works with Ableton as well. Ableton's a bit different because it's got a different interface. But yeah, I'll take you through exactly how, why, and what to set up. So let's rock. Okay, so this is the file that we're using, mainly because it's sent to me by a client. He's an Indian guy. This is a Punjabi track, funnily enough. I get to mix some pretty random things sometimes. But he sent me this because basically, if you have a look, it's completely in default settings, and he's just basically essentially sent me the stems. So he's written it. I don't know if he's written it in Logic or whether someone sent him the stems for the tracks. But as you can see, that it's all in blue. If you have a look at the icons, it's all basic icons and stuff like that. So there's a couple of things we need to do first. This is where I'd essentially start. I mean, you can do this before this has even got any audio in, but also you can do this at this stage. I would definitely suggest you get a template and save it as a template and then work from that. If you're ever going to write a track, especially if it's ever going to get it mixed by other people, this is a great way to start. So there's a couple of things that we need to do. And first and foremost, what I usually do is we need to set up a couple of sends. I'm used to working on a 48 channel SSL console in the hardware world, which is the traditional way, and this is essentially set up like that. So we've got the faders, you've got your pan knobs, you've got your outputs here. Logic's nice, it's actually showing you the EQ curve, which is really good. The one thing I don't like about Logic that I find better with Pro Tools is I actually quite like to see all the slots that you've got of your inserts and your sends, which are in this region here. The thing is that essentially Logic sort of lets you just shows whatever you're using. So if there's no sends, nothing's happening. Now, there's a couple of things that need to happen first and foremost. We want to cluster all the sounds that are similar to each other into the same position. We've then got them all clumped together, and I like to color code them. The thing with Logic is you can't really do that in the mix window. Pro Tools you can just grab this and move this along, but as you'll see with Logic it doesn't let you do that. The faders are kind of fixed. So if you want to actually do that, you need to do it in what's called the arrangement window, which is this window. Okay, so the arrangement window is great, but I would then, so a couple of things. One, I like to change the icons. So I'm going to the icon here. We've got other, we haven't got vocals, that's right, from memory. And we've got a male and female vocal there. So we're going to do that as a vocal. The other thing I like to do is go up here, it says window, it's in view, show colors. And I will then start color coding. Now that's a really important thing. I've had a lot of people say, oh, is it really necessary? Well, it is, especially if you're dealing with a big mix. And I deal with mixes, a lot of big pop mixes and stuff that can go into 100 tracks or 80 to 100, 60 to 100 tracks, which that's a lot of tracks. And you want to be able to see where all your drums are at any given time, and you want to be able to see where your bass is at any given time, that kind of thing. Now, if you want to know the color codes that I generally use blue for drums, red for bass, green for guitars, and then basically any of strings instruments or anything orchestral, I'll probably use the more orangey looking, browner looking stuff. For synths and keys, I generally use a dark, sort of mid blue going off into purple. And then essentially for anything that's like vocals, I'll use a pink, mainly because of skin color and the like. That's my logic. That's how I do it. See the pun there with Logic. But yeah, basically it's really quite useful to do that. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to select the regions that you're coloring, and then basically I select that region and color it. Now, one of the things about Logic is it sort of doesn't color at the same time. There's a preset in Pro Tools where you can have the track color reflects whatever color. That doesn't happen here, but there is a way to get around it. You hit Command and then you hit that and it'll actually change that color too. And yeah, if you go into here from memory, you've got it, the colors, it's in the configure the head or whatever it's called. So track header components, you want track to protect, you want the color here somewhere. Where's the color? Track color bars, you want that. So I like track color bars because then you're starting to highlight all that kind of stuff. Okay, now we're going to pop back off into the Command 2, back into the mix window. The other thing that I want to start setting up is the sends, as I was just talking about. Now, Logic's really funny as far as when it comes to sends. I find it a bit clunky because it sort of does the sends for you. Plus, if you're going through a number of, I found this out last night, if you're going through a number of different projects, it tends to inherit the sends and the I/O configuration from that. So that's kind of be a challenge because it then renames stuff, and if you've got your sends name something in one session and then you open another session, it sort of converts it across, which I find a bit clunky. And I thought Pro Tools was a bit clunky the way it did its I/O, but this is even more clunky. But okay, I'm going to set up a send because I want to do a plate reverb here. Now, I think from here, this is the Vox plate that basically, essentially, these are all from literally a session that I did was working on last night, and now essentially I've got to go with those. I'll talk about these in a minute, buses, but I'm doing a vocal plate. Now, the funny thing is, Logic then sets up a vocal plate over here at the end, which is kind of good in the mixer. It's essentially emulating when you're working on a console. Essentially how a console works is your sends is your effects section. Your EQ is, say you've got an SSL, you'll have your EQ and your dynamics down that channel, which is what this is trying to emulate. In audio effects, you'll have your input, which is your preamps, and then down here you'll have your effects sends just above the pans. That's where the usual standard format for a console, and it's still good to work in this day and age, mainly because any of the pros, that's essentially how they work. In the old days, basically, you really only had one reverb unit. Reverbs and delays take up a lot of processing power, and in the old days, the way you were more efficient with your processing power is you'd do a send. So you'd set, and the other extra benefit with that is essentially that a reverb, if you're using it as a global reverb, like, you've got one Vox plate that you're using, that then and using it on all the vocals, it's a great way to unify the vocals, but also when you're mixing, and this is a really, really big tip, you're using that as a weapon in your mix to put all the instruments, because some of them might have been recorded other places, some of them might have been part of instrument libraries, you're putting them all in the same space. And I'll basically say the logic to you now. So I'll use a typical vocal plate. I'll probably have a snare reverb, which is the other thing that we'll set up. But also, essentially, I will have a room reverb, depending on if I've tracked it at the studio that I work out of or not. If I've got a lot of room mics, I may not use a room as much, but then I'll also have a big reverb where it'll be a hall or something like that, or whatever I'm then essentially placing this mix into to give it the atmosphere. And how I mix then is essentially reverb, how wet it is, sort of puts any instrument back in the mix, and it's a really good tip to do that. A lot of people are afraid to use reverbs and don't get that point, that essentially reverb is what you're using to create depth in your mix, and it's helping create your soundstage. Panning is placing the instruments on the 2D scale. Well, reverb is a great way to create depth and essentially give you the 3D elements. So the more reverb, the further back something is. And the drier it is, the more forward it is. And definitely use that. That's a trick you use with vocals. You'll use a plate reverb to, make the vocals work, but essentially I tend to put the vocals with a bit less space of the big reverb because the vocals are sitting loud and proud at the front. You need to kind of imagine a stage, and you're then creating it on the stage. So I'll show you again. Basically down here, I'm going to then create another reverb, which is the big verb here. These are all written in the I/O. You can go up here where it says mix and I/O labels and scroll down here, which, as I said, I find a little bit clunky. I do really quite prefer Pro Tools as set up like this, but with this I/O you can then go down to your outputs, and you can be provided by driver, which is what I'm doing for actual outputs, because I've got, as I mentioned before, I've got 32 I/O including the monitor left and right. I'm going to call that. Oh, won't let me do it. Okay, I've got 32. Logic really likes to have one stereo output. It's really kind of curious because it's quite clunky to see if you're doing multiple ins and outs. If you go into the preferences, where your audio and your recording, wherever it is, your I/O assignments, it sort of just shows one or two. Maybe it's just the Apollo, but I've noticed, I did see someone the other day who's actually got them all, but it's kind of funny that it likes this stereo output thing. But you have to go into your I/O, especially if you're using a UAD Apollo, because the way it talks to Logic is a little bit different. But essentially, I've got my I/O there, which is going into my summing mixer. That's the thing I'm going to make the most of, and I'm going to show you how I get around that. And then essentially, then you've got what we do, your buses. Now, with these buses, a guy asked me the other day, what's a bus? Well, the buses can be two things. A bus is either a send bus, which basically, like what I just did with the reverb, you're sending some of that signal. Instead of using it as an insert, you're sending some of that signal to another channel, which has, say, a reverb on there is an insert, and then you can use this little knob here to change the amount that you're sending that signal to. So essentially that's, a quarter of the signal. So instead of having it as an insert, instead of having the reverb as an insert, that is a send, and it's going over here, which is great because then I've got two vocals there. I can send them both there, and I can have one a little bit wetter than the other. Wetter means the amount of effect that we're using, but essentially that is going to be the reverb for the vocal, which is good because then you've got a same reverb across the vocals, and it sounds more cohesive. So not only is it saving processing, but it sounds more cohesive. And in this day and age, especially, that's how we all got into doing stuff like that. Okay, now the other thing that I do is I set up buses. Now you'll see here it says drums, bass, vox, snare verb. I had to do that with another session because someone had essentially sent me a session that had a lot of stuff all over the place, and I tried to bus it. Usually I'll do drums, bass, guitars, keys, maybe a lead instrument, effects, that kind of stuff. Usually going that way. Now what that means is that's a group bus, all right? And so it's essentially a bus. It's really quite useful for me because I'll set these buses up and then send that out to the summing mixer. So Logic's kind of curious like the way it does that. It then needs to create another bus to send stuff out. So hypothetically what I'd do is I'd go down here, I'd select these two. I'm so used to Pro Tools, I keep on doing the Pro Tools shortcut. Set that up to a bus, and we're going to send that out to, where is it, the vocal bus here, Vox. Okay, then all the way over here, and we need to color code that. I'm going to color code that purple for the moment, just because that is the vocal bus. That's the vocal bus. There's the Vox plate. I usually like doing them dark colors because sends are usually pretty dark, and that's the big reverb there. Now I know Logic tries to be a little bit more user-friendly to people just starting out, but I find some of the way that they do their I/O is a bit clunky. But either way, now we've set up a vocal bus. So what I'm going to then do is I'll put an insert of, say, one of my favorite reverbs. Where is it? 140 plate, EMT 140 plate. There you go. I'll put that reverb on. And essentially that's going to be my reverb for tracking vocals. Now, as you'll see, something I discovered last night too, which is kind of good, or I might do that in another video. I've converted some of my plugins to shortcuts so they actually fit within the menu, because otherwise if I wanted to do, say, a big reverb and I wanted to do something to do with Universal Audio, I've got all these third-party plugins that I've got to then go to there and then scroll all the way down here. So I'm going to do that in another episode. That'll probably be the next one I do. Look how many plugins I've got. But essentially, yeah, being able to put them all in here as either favorites, where is it, favorites here, or being able to incorporate them as part of the main menu here under what sort of type of plugin they are is actually a huge help. So I'll do that in another video when it comes to Logic. People are using Logic more and more, so this is going to be a thing. Anyway, so I'm going to quickly shut this session and show you what the final outlook looks like. I'm not playing you the song mainly because it's for the client's benefit and his copyrights, but essentially I don't think it's necessary anyway. It's just more about just formatting something. Okay, so here's my final mix, right? So what I've done is I've put all the vocals together, I've put any effects together. As you see, I've even used the icons. This is an Indian track, so I've used some of the Indian looking percussion stuff, and there's a sitar there and stuff for the strings. I've then, I've done the strings in yellow just because it was one of the colours that I wasn't using as much. The bass, as you'll see, the bass is done in red, then all the drums, and essentially up here, what I've done is if you're working with a summing mixer, you have to actually, you can't offline bounce like Logic normally does. Because I'm running through a summing mixer, you've got to run it through the analog hardware. So I'm running it through the hardware via this, which I'll show you. I've done buses for all this stuff. So I've done buses here, which is drums, bass, keys, strings, percussion, FX, and vocals. And here's all my send reverbs. As you see, there's a live room, there's a big verb, there's a vocal delay, that kind of stuff. Then they're going out to separate outputs. These are the hardware outputs, which are then, actually they pop up here, which is a bit curious. But yeah, that's okay. It means that I've got an extra stage of processing that I can use. If I was doing that with Pro Tools, it doesn't generally do that. You could set up an extra channel if you wanted, but it's setting up extra channels that Logic does. I find that a little bit clunky because if I want to go to an out, I just want to go to an out. But then essentially this first one is my main mix down bus, which is all the way, which is basically, if you have a look at this channel, this is the only one going to stereo out. And this is essentially what I do is I run it through the summing mixer, through the G-Bus compressor, and back into a Logic session, and then monitor that. There's a function on the Sigma that you can hit external, which basically then only monitors the stereo left and right. Just nearly had a brain melt then. But essentially, yeah, that's a really big thing. So essentially, it's going through the whole session, and then I'm monitoring back in. So I won't play it too, but yeah, so as you can see, I've color-coded everything. Now at a glance, I can see everything that's supposed to be happening. I don't know why that's changed color. I wasn't supposed to do that. Or I may have just done that, but yeah, I've sort of made that all light blue, make it that blue. And colored it through. Now I can see all the drums are together, the bass is together, that kind of stuff. And yeah, it's a really, really useful way to do it. But also, if you're going to send it to a mix engineer, it'll save you, the mix engineer, a good lot of time, especially setting this kind of stuff up. But it also means if you're doing it yourself and you want to send it to a mix engineer, you've basically, with the sends, you can make those decisions as to what your send reverbs are and stuff. But it'll give the mix engineer an opportunity, if he wants to then change it out, for say you've got a plate reverb, I can put an EMT plate, or Ocean Way plugins. I'm a big fan of UAD, as you can see. But yeah, that's really quite good. Now the funny thing is, the stereo out then comes up here to the master. This is where, if you work with 2-bus plugins, which is basically what it means is if you're working with extra plugins on your master bus, this is where you would do it, because then it sort of posts the fader that it's come in and it's recorded in, but then it's sort of working in parallel kind of thing, I suppose you'd do. You could actually put them on this channel, which is what you do in Pro Tools, which is the one up the top, or as I said with Logic, you've got an extra channel that it does this thing as far as its output. It's like doing an extra bus. But yeah, essentially I've got drums, bass, keys, strings, and here I've got the ability to then, when I'm actually mixing, I then do what's called console mentality, or what I call console mentality, which is essentially I would then process it like I'm doing an SSL console. So I've got the SSL console summing, and I've also got the digital strips, which is great. It's all the convenience of working in the box, but all the sound of using analog gear. So it's pretty amazing. So there you go. Anyway, that's a quick rundown of exactly how I set stuff up. The main thing is having these sends set up instead of putting reverbs as inserts. Reverbs and delays, if you can do it as a send, definitely do it. It just works so much better. It also saves you a lot of processing power. And if you can color code all of your tracks so you can see them at a glance, and also if you can set up buses, it is certainly a benefit if you're going to get someone like me or any kind of mix engineer to do it. Buses are a great way to give them the ability to process stuff. The whole idea is when things are recorded in different places, you want to make them sound cohesive. So I hope that was helpful. And yeah, look, I'm going to do another video on a few things and shortcuts for Logic. I often do most of my videos in Pro Tools, but I'm going to be doing a lot more Logic as well, mainly because it seems that everyone seems to be working in Logic at the moment. So look out for more of those, and this will be up really soon.